welcome to the second AfOx insaka. For those who weren't here for the first one, the Africa Oxford Initiative is a platform for, as we call it, all things Africa in Oxford. It's mainly a collaboration between Oxford academics and partners in different African institutions. And what we aim to do is facilitate equitable relationships between Oxford University and African academics and African institutions. So we're very, very proud to have you all here, and we're particularly honored to be here at Martin School, and we hope that you enjoy the day and the sessions for today. So without taking much more of your time, allow me to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Anna Namburete. Dr. Namburete is a research fellow at the Department of Engineering. She's going to be talking to us about imaging the fetal brain using ultrasound. And what you didn't know about Dr. Namburete is that she's an excellent salsa dancer. So one of the greatest in Oxford, by the way. So I'm really honored. We're really proud to have you with us today. So I would look forward to hearing your thoughts on fetal brain imaging. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, for that introduction. If I don't dazzle you with my talk, I'll dazzle you with my dance moves. So. Sorry, just 1 second. Okay, so as Anne mentioned, I will be talking about how to image the fetal brain using ultrasound. And the reason I'm interested in this topic is because my background is I am from Mozambique, and I have a background in biomedical engineering. And what I aim to do is actually develop appropriate and affordable tools to benefit prenatal care in African settings. So the first thing to do is maybe to understand what's done in clinical care, the standard practice. So when we want to date a pregnancy, so figure out how far along a mother is and when the delivery will take place, we collect two-dimensional images from 3 parts of the body. One of them is the femur, the other is the abdomen, and the third is the fetal head. So we take these two-dimensional scans and we collect the measurements, simple linear measurements, such as the head circumference or the diameters. And then we take these measurements and regress them to population growth curves. So by doing so, we can tell whether the baby is growing within the bounds of normal development or if there's something adverse happening, so such as malnutrition or any other infection. However, if we look around the room, I'm sure we can agree that our heights do not inform on our age, right? So the same is true for fetuses and babies. Now, if we look at two babies that are the same age, we cannot tell just from size alone whether they're healthy or, well, in the case of when they're small, we can't tell if they're just small for their age or if they're malnourished, there's something else going on. So that tells us that, size is not a good enough marker of how well the fetus is maturing. So we need another measure. And since I'm interested in developing tools for an African setting, and in particular a rural setting, I decided to think about how we can exclude the size information and still have a measure of how well the baby is doing during pregnancy. So I traveled around. I went to Mozambique, my home country. I went to Malawi and to Ghana. And I wanted to have an idea of what tools are available, what sort of problems are they facing in terms of prenatal care monitoring, and what we can do as engineers. So one of the things that I learned was that in standard care, the first scan is collected at 11 weeks. But in rural settings, because of logistics such as the distance from the home and the nearest clinic, the women will usually attend for care late in pregnancy, at 24 weeks. And this is quite an important point because between 11 and 24 weeks, there's quite a lot of development that takes place. In the womb, development occurs over the scale of days. So if we're missing out on a few months, then we've missed the window to really quantify how well the baby's doing. That also means that the clinician only has the single visit from which to base all the clinical decisions. So they don't have the luxury of tracking the pregnancy over the case of over the scale of many scans. So yeah, that's quite difficult. The other thing is, because they show up so late, there are large variations in fetal size. So we cannot just use size as a metric anymore. And in these settings, as we all know, there's usually low literacy rate. So there's unreliable menstrual history. So we don't have a reference for how far along the mother is in her pregnancy. It means that a mother can come in, she can be anywhere between 5 and 8 months of pregnancy, and the doctor has no way of knowing. And the reason why it's important to know precisely how old the baby is because that informs interventions if anything is detected. Right, so size is out of the table, right? One thing that I learned in my research is that if we look at brain development, we see that there's a very precise pattern at which the folds of the brain appear on the surface of the brain, yeah? So you see at 25 weeks, there's just what's called the Sylvian fissure, it's a little indent, and then as pregnancy progresses, we see more folds appear until it resembles the adult brain. And this pattern is so predictable. It's really a schedule that it follows, that some MRI studies and some postmortem studies have actually shown that this can be used as a measure of age and maturation, as long as the baby's healthy, of course. Now, there are two ways to non-invasively image the brain. One is to use ultrasound, and the other one is to use MRI. Now, an ultrasound machine will cost roughly, well, no more than 15,000 pounds. Now there are some really great machines that you can buy for 3,000 pounds, and the quality is just as good as some of the higher end ones. And they're portable, so you can actually take them out to the communities that need them. An MRI machine, on the other hand, you get better image quality. However, it requires quite a lot more infrastructure to set up, so definitely not portable. And it will cost you over 2 million pounds. So in that sense, ultrasound wins in terms of portability and cost. And in particular, if we're thinking of resource-constrained countries, they're not going to buy MRI machines for standard prenatal monitoring. We're going to maybe invest in ultrasound, but not in MRI. So it would be really exciting, actually, to start using ultrasound, developing the tools for this technology that's existed for many years, and extract as much information as we can from them. Now, when most people think of ultrasound, they think of an image sort of like this, where you have very low tissue contrast, and it's an old technology. It emerged maybe in the 70s in the clinic, but we have to commend them. They did really well in taking an image like this, collecting very simple measurements, like these, yeah, and regressing to growth, right? So with this very, very simple image, simple measurement, they can predict when is the baby going to be born. How well is it doing? Is it normal? Is it starving? Is there something else going on? So it's not surprising that this is still standard practice till today. However, we have to move on, and we have to start thinking about what modern ultrasound looks like. And this is what we get these days. So we do get higher resolution, we get more structural definition, as you can see on the left side of the image. And that really allows us to start thinking beyond the skull, so beyond the cranial vault, as I think of it. And in fact, if we look at an ultrasound image next to an MRI image, we can see that although the image values, the intensity values are so different, there is correspondence between the structures that we do see between them. So it's just a matter of understanding it. And one thing that I found in my research that's really exciting is that that pattern that I said about the structures appearing on the brain at the specific times in pregnancy, we can see that in ultrasound as well. So I showed this as an example. The pink structure on the top left, that is the Sylvian fissure. And if we take a cross-section of the brain, I highlighted it in pink here, so it's easier for you to see. But you can see that the structure starts out at 18 weeks of pregnancy, quite smooth, it's a small bump, and then it gets progressively pinched over the course of pregnancy. Now, the fact that we can see this in ultrasound is phenomenally exciting. Right, so now the challenge is in taking this information and actually mapping it to age or maturation. And what I do is I actually develop machine learning algorithms to do this, so computational algorithms. Most people by now have heard this term, machine learning, and it falls under the umbrella of artificial intelligence. All it is a field in computer science which really seeks to extract patterns from data. And in this case, the data would be images, and they would be annotated or labeled by an expert. So in my case, we have an image of the brain. A clinician will say, yeah, from the menstrual history, we know this is 20 weeks in or 25 weeks in. And then the algorithm will automatically learn what a 20-week brain looks like, what a 25-week brain looks like, and so on. And then we'll be able to predict it. So these algorithms are really powerful. They've been used for image categorization, basically saying, yes, this is a skull image, yes, this is a heart image, and so on. They've been used to detect organs within an image, and they've been able to identify the regions, important regions in medical images. Now, whenever you want to use machine learning, you need big data. And this is where this wonderful study comes in. So this is the Intergrowth 21st study. I know that Kevin March has worked on this, and I think a few people in the audience I recognize from the network. So it's a large multi-site study, and they collected data from over 4,000 healthy mothers all across the world, and these mothers were scanned every 5 weeks during their pregnancy. So it's quite a it's a comprehensive longitudinal study. So I have been using these data to design these algorithms to be able to learn, well, for my algorithms to learn what the brain looks like at different stages. Right, so what my algorithm does is it takes a set of images, passes it through this machine learning algorithm, and it produces a mapping between image appearance and age. So on the x-axis we see true age, and on the y-axis predicted age. And the goal is that if we are given a new image, we don't know how old the baby will be, but we pass it through the algorithm and we're able to get an age prediction. Right, and this, I must emphasize, is actually not using any size information. It's just using information about the appearance of the brain. So when we look at the results, if we think back to the standard metrics, which was using the head circumference to predict age, if we look at this graph, what we'd like to see is we have true age and predicted age on the y-axis. We have the line of equality. We want all of the points to be on the line of equality. And as I said earlier, these methods have worked quite well. If we look particularly in early pregnancy, they're doing quite well at being on the line. But we have to remember that in these settings, most women come in for a scan anywhere here. And that's where you start to see the errors in the predictions. So when we use this brain-based method, we start to see a difference, particularly in the third trimester of pregnancy. So the error bounds are much tighter. We get a much more accurate prediction, and there's no systematic bias at any stage in pregnancy. So that's really exciting. Right. So one thing that I wanted to do to be able to roll this out to the clinics that would actually use them is to create an a graphical user interface, or a GUI, that clinicians would be able to use. This is a video. It's not really working. Okay, anyway, it's a very simple to use graphical user interface, which I ideally would like to mount onto a tablet. And then the ultrasound scan could be also collected with a small portable device. And then this can be taken out to the communities that need them, so that the mothers don't have to come to the clinic. They don't have to travel in. We, as the medical community, could travel out to basically detect anything before birth. And this way we would be able to inform on clinical interventions much earlier, because we would detect them with these tools. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much. And I'll now take your questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was really, really brilliant, right? So we'll welcome a few minutes of Q&A. We have a mic moving about. Yeah, there you are. So we have a mic moving about. Feel free to ask a few more questions before we get on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Kindly say your name and something before you ask the question.
Thank you very much, Anna. My name is Jaleba Lovalama, pediatrician from Kenya. I'm a DPhil student here in Oxford. Your presentation was very exciting, especially for me, since I like children, and I really love seeing people taking care of the child. It's unusual for a presentation of this sort to focus on the child rather than focusing on the mother. But that's another story for another day. So my question, I have two quick questions. One is, when the dating ultrasound, we know that the ultrasound has huge issues in terms of inter and intra-observer errors, and there's always a margin of error on the weeks.
Yes.
I don't know how you handle that in your model.
That's an excellent question, because as we know that in the clinic they are collecting 2D scans, right? And this research study actually worked only on 3D scans, because we wanted to basically honor the fact that the brain is a three-dimensional organ. And if you take a two-dimensional scan, you might be actually capturing different brain structures. But we are extending this such that it will work on two-dimensional data, because there is quite a lot of variation in the size. But what we can do is look at the presence and absence of structures, which would be size independent. And then if certain structures are already present, then it tells you it has matured to this stage. Yep.
Am I allowed the second one?
Pass them around and then go.
Okay.
Hi, Anna. I'm Maureen Kelly. I'm with the AfOx Center in Population Health and work in ethics. And this was fantastic, really important work. I was wondering if you mentioned with the machine learning that it requires big data, and you're within a network that's already sharing data quite freely and intergrowth and interbio. In terms of scale up beyond those networks, do you anticipate any challenges or barriers to the data sharing that's necessary for this to work?
The great thing about these algorithms is they only need to be trained once. So as long as the data that I train my algorithm with is diverse enough, basically representative of the types of images that we would encounter in different clinical settings, then it should be fine. I would only need to use the large data set once, and then it can be applied to any single image anywhere at any time.
Sorry, Charles Newton from Kilifi, Kenya.
Hi.
Great piece of work. You mentioned that you're also looking at the frontal lobes and other parts of the brain. I mean, does that increase the specificity of your gestational aging in that context, or is it just too difficult in order to collect that information from the scans that you're getting?
Right, so I don't specify which part of the brain it should use. So I let the algorithm explore and decide on its own what it deems as age discriminating. So there is one, actually. So a lot of people see these machine learning algorithms as black boxes, and sometimes that's the stigma against them. So I actually ran an experiment where I looked at which brain regions are being selected during the age prediction process. And what I found, so what you see at the top are the hotspots, basically, what it deemed as important. And it did coincide with the localization of the Sylvian fissure. So it's what connects the frontal and temporal lobes, which is what I expected to see, because that's the structure we actually see most clearly in ultrasound data. So yeah, this was pretty encouraging, but it's still just a trial.
My name is Eric Ohoma. Yeah. Thanks very much, Anna, and for the wonderful presentation. Obviously, this is something that is, close to home, as I was a statistician on the intergrowth and interbio projects. I mean, I've got several reactions, but I'll probably just try to minimize them. So, I mean, one of the questions that have been asked, if I may just follow up on that, is about the idea of using intergrowth, which is ideally was a healthy population.
Yes.
And I do wonder, as you say, that the data is trained into the machines, and then after that they train and they're able to pick up or estimate gestational age. I wonder what you'd get if you use a different data set, which was coming from a non-healthy population. Yeah. That's just a follow-up question. But more interesting was the idea of when you showed the kind of your predicted age versus true age when you use size compared to the brain imaging. And if you look at the variability in terms of your predictions, I don't know if you've quantified how much variability in the true gestational age you get in terms of days.
Yeah.
Because we know, using size alone, we've looked at estimates of gestational age, and part of the problem has always been reducing the amount of variability, which is about, in late gestational age, about a week. And I wonder
It's more than that in late gestational age. I thought it was more like 2 to 3 weeks.
It's, depending on which equation
which
you're using.
Cohort, yeah, and which equation, sure.
But I would be interested to see how much reduction in error you've been able to achieve using imaging, because that's a question that's always come up.
Yeah, so at the moment, to answer this question directly, I'm getting plus minus 6 days throughout the entire age range. So it's not varying as with the size measures. So basically, if you're at 20 weeks, you are getting within 6 days, but then in later gestation, you're getting 2 to 3 weeks, which is what I found. Whereas with this method, you're just getting 6 days all throughout. So that you can inform the parents, this is the predicted age, but the error you can expect is always 6 days, rather than, could be weeks, could be days, I'm not sure. But to answer your first question, which was about training with a different data set, or a not optimally healthy data set, it really depends on what question you're trying to answer. Because if you want to use this type of tool to basically to identify whether it's healthy and how delayed a certain patient might be, then you want to train on only healthy. But if you want the tool to generalize and be able to predict age regardless of what the condition is, then you want to have that diverse data set of healthy and at-risk babies. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I was more concerned with the growth of fetuses who are not healthy because it's dependent on the structures.
Yes.
So if the structures are not developing well,
Mm-hmm.
it's over-isolate or under-isolate.
Yeah. Okay, so I tried it.
Based on the structure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tried it on some of the preterm babies, and these are very initial results. It looks like they might be slightly delayed. Yeah, from Hinterka. Oh, okay. Yeah. Anyway, I should speak to you about this more because the statistics behind it would be really interesting. Anyway, any further questions?
Hi, I'm Kristin in the Department of Psychiatry. I was just wondering, so this makes a lot of sense to me in terms of dating, just because the brain, as you say, I mean, even when there's intrauterine growth restriction, there's a brain sparing effect, so it makes sense that the brain would be kind of the best place to look for dating. Yeah. But I just wondered sort of long term, like if this works, obviously you'd miss other things if you don't look at the abdomen, for example, because of like intrauterine growth restriction. You want to see what is the kind of ratio. I just wondered, are you thinking of that in future, detecting other abnormalities and things, particularly when it is just a nurse or someone going out and they don't necessarily have the training to interpret that themselves?
Yes, so my interest is in malnutrition and being able to detect that and really see if there's any effect on the brain. Because yes, I do think that there might be a brain sparing effect, but looking at other parts of the body can inform us a bit more. So I currently have a student who is looking at quantifying sort of fat development, adipose tissue, and linking that to the trajectory of brain maturation and seeing at which point we start. Well, from fat development, we can see when the baby's starving, but can we see at which point that any brain delays are triggered after, linked with the fat underdevelopment? Yeah.
Wow, this is absolutely brilliant. Thank you so very much, Anna. We really enjoyed that, but I'm going to cut the questions there so we can move on with the spirit of insaka. And in the spirit of the insaka, we have phenomenal presentations, and most importantly, from very diverse backgrounds. So the next speaker I'm going to introduce is Dr. Simukai Chigudu, or as we call him, Dr. Simukai is a Departmental Lecturer at the Oxford Department of International Development. He is medical science. He's a medic, but also a politician or a political scientist. I'm not sure what to call him. He's also an avid hip hop fan. I will have you know. And recently we saw him on the BBC talking about the Zimbabwe situation. And it is not a coincidence that he is actually here today to talk about the politics of cholera, focusing on Zimbabwe. So we're very honored to have you. A very timely presentation, I have to say. And we look forward to hearing from you. Welcome.
Sorry, Anne, how do I... The mouse doesn't seem to be working. Oh.
A way to escape from this.
Where's it, that one?
Yeah. Kukwa, you have it, okay.
Sorry.
That's all right. Is this one right?
Yeah.
Okay. Presentation mode.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me here. And I just want to state at the outset that I am absolutely not a politician, lest military tanks start to appear on the outskirts of Oxford. It is timely to be speaking about the politics of cholera in Zimbabwe, given the events of the recent week. And I think that the scenes and images that have been flooding our TV screens, celebrating the end of Mugabe's tenure as president, are fundamentally tied to a host of different political, economic, and social experiences that people have had, especially since the 2000s. Stories of intense and difficult suffering that express themselves through all manner of crises. And today I'm going to be speaking in particular about Zimbabwe's cholera outbreak. And so my story begins in August 2008. And during this time, a catastrophic cholera outbreak engulfed the high-density urban townships in Harare's metropolitan area. Within a matter of weeks, the disease rapidly spread to peri-urban and then rural areas throughout the country before crossing its borders into our neighboring countries, South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, and Mozambique. Over a 10-month period, cholera infected nearly 100,000 people, claimed the lives of about 4,000, and at the peak of the epidemic, it had an unprecedentedly high case fatality rate, thereby making Zimbabwe's 2008 and 2009 cholera outbreak the most extensive in recorded African history. Now, in this presentation, I'm not going to talk about the making of the cholera outbreak or the politics of it in terms of governmental structures, but rather looking at the social politics of the cholera outbreak. See, all cholera outbreaks, much like any disaster, are social phenomena. In every phase and aspect of a disaster, the causes, vulnerability, preparedness, results, response, and reconstruction, essentially the contours of disaster and the difference between who lives and who dies is to a greater or lesser extent a social calculus. You see, outbreaks like cholera mark the difference between rescue and abandonment, between privilege and objection, and between inclusion and exclusion within the body politic. And so studying the social and political dimensions of cholera yields distinct insights into the nature of crises and by extension into the nature of citizenship. So throughout this presentation, I don't treat citizenship as the formal juridical category of belonging within a national polity. Rather, I look at citizenship as an iterative encounter between people and institutions of the state. And I argue, of course, that disasters and crises such as the cholera outbreak show these encounters in a sharp and detailed perspective. By extension, I also argue that born of these encounters are what I'm going to be referring to as political subjectivities. In other words, how did people understand themselves in relation to the authorities that govern them? How did they make sense of their position within society? How, for instance, did Zimbabwe's or Harare's high-density township residents come to understand and experience the outbreak in terms of Zimbabwe's larger social, economic, and political dynamics? So before getting into that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about cholera, the disease itself, in brief. I'm going to say a word or two about how I actually did this work and the kind of theoretical contributions that this portion of my work is speaking to. I'm going to discuss then methodologically what I did and highlight some of the key themes that have emerged from this portion of the research before concluding. So cholera is a bacterial infection of the intestine characterized by acute watery diarrhea and vomiting. The disease is spread by the ingestion of food or water contaminated by certain strains of the organism Vibrio cholerae. Now, importantly, cholera requires a very gross level of contamination to produce illness in healthy individuals. As such, cholera outbreaks only tend to occur in contexts where people are living in overcrowded and dilapidated shelter, where sanitary conditions are poor, and where malnutrition is severe and widespread. In the most severe cases, the disease can kill with terrifying speed due to precipitous dehydration. Left untreated, cholera has a mortality rate of about 50%. However, with effective replacement of fluids and electrolytes, typically through simple oral rehydration therapy, mortality can be reduced to less than 1%. Now, given that cholera is difficult to spread and easy to treat with a simple therapeutic tool, one of course that is readily and cheaply available worldwide, no one should die of cholera today. Thus, the occurrence of cholera outbreaks, especially where there isn't an environmental catastrophe or the open outbreak of war, should always trouble us. Now, coming to talk and to write about the social experience of disasters is an immensely vexing task. The narratives that people told me in my work exhibit multiple logics, styles, and mutations, and they all relate to each other through mediation, contradiction, and transformation. So any attempt to render these multifarious stories legible is unavoidably an act of realist fiction. and I accept that this may sound like heresy to the scientists in the room. Now, I examined the origins of the cholera outbreak, the manner of its unfolding, and the lived experience of the disaster, and of course the attendant political subjectivities through a range of different sources. Of central importance, as I've suggested, were the stories that people told about the outbreak. And I want to suggest to you that the retelling of experiences of the outbreak is significant, not only for bringing hitherto undocumented narratives to light, but also for what such retelling says of those narrators themselves and of the way that the cholera disaster has been committed to historical memory. I make the case that the telling of stories is always a political act, and in this way, stories are an especially illuminating prism through which to explore the politics and the social contours of the cholera outbreak and its aftermath. The anthropologist Nikhil Anand writes that stories have multiple vocalities and multiple sites of production. He contends that stories are especially attuned to diverse locations at which human agency is hampered, but they also present other ways of knowing the world. In this sense, storytelling is actually a vital human strategy for sustaining agency in the face of circumstances that the storytellers might otherwise find disempowering. Furthermore, the act of reconstituting events, even catastrophes, in a story means that one is no longer living those events in passivity, but is actively reworking them in dialogue with others and within one's own imagination. And it's this dialogical character of storytelling that reveals an intricate relation between individual and collective memory, showing that memory is always a complex composite, neither entirely ineffable and individual, nor entirely socially determined. So my work has much in common with the work of the anthropologist Charles Briggs, who studied the manifold meanings of cholera in the wake of the 1992-93 epidemic of cholera on the Orinoco Delta of Venezuela. In his magisterial work, Stories in the Time of Cholera, Briggs argues that illness narratives told during and after epidemics may help people cope with the search for order that takes place when sickness shatters their perspectives on daily life. However, competing narratives inevitably emerge, and they characterize the same event in quite different ways, thereby inviting highly contrastive sorts of remedial action. In Briggs's case study, and so it is in mine, cholera created a charged and high-stakes debate about the lives of the people it infected and about their political implications. As he puts it, each cholera story creates a dramatis personae, a series of events and a set of causal inferences, casting some parties as heroes who acted wisely and courageously, and others as villains who promoted death for gain or glory. And still, of course, others as pathetic bystanders, not smart enough to get out of the way in the face of disaster. And it is not simply the content of cholera narratives that render them potent. In examining the mechanisms through which stories were produced, transmitted, imbued with legitimacy and challenged, we see that stories had very real effects on how people lived and thus on how they died. Now, I excavated my cholera stories, as it were, through a series of in-depth interviews, focus group discussions, and informal conversations with about 76 residents of the high-density areas of Buririro, Glenora, Glenview, Tsivarasekwa, Kwadzana, Mabvuku-Tafara, Norton, and Chitungwiza. Essentially, most of the areas highlighted in purple in the kind of southwest portion of Harare. My interlocutors, so you have a bit of a sense of who they are, all reside in these high-density townships. But despite this commonality, the people who I interviewed do not constitute a homogeneous group. Their demographic profile is highly varied. In terms of age, I made an effort to interview across generation, and will show you that I've captured the voices of people who were school children during the outbreak, as well as voices of grandparents who have lived in the township since before independence. In terms of socioeconomic status, most of the people I spoke to work in Zimbabwe's informal sector, while a few are employed as teachers or local administrators. And some work within local NGOs or in the media. In terms of political party affiliation, many of my interviewees chose to remain tacit about where their true loyalties lie, but the overwhelming majority of them were hostile to the ruling party. And so I've organized the stories across three main themes. Now, as I sort of keep emphasizing, the stories that people tell kind of point to the crucial importance, the stories that people tell about cholera point to the crucial importance of people's relationship to things like medicine and public health, to humanitarian organizations, to political parties, even to physical infrastructure, such as piping and taps, boreholes, as well as to what they understand as the state. And thus, these stories are co-constitutive of the disease's politics. They take us through questions around legitimacy and social standing, about anger and recrimination, and about ideology and historical consciousness. I've organized these stories according to three major themes that I've labeled the political context. In other words, how do people talk about cholera in the context of everything else that was happening at the time? In terms of political etiologies, how do people identify the root causes of the cholera outbreak? What is, as medics would say, the etiologies of this disease? Here, of course, located within its politics. And how do people make sense of the political response to the outbreak when it occurred? So the first theme, I began all of my interviews in the townships with the same question. What was life like for you in 2008? My first interviewee was a buxom and hearty 62-year-old resident of Kwazana called Tsitsi. Tsitsi works as a part-time vendor and masseuse in Harare, and she is, as she put it, a natural-born hustler. And she said to me, "We suffered in 2008. In general, life wasn't very good at all in terms of contaminated water. The city council couldn't afford to buy chemicals. We were drinking contaminated water, which affected us with cholera. So people were dying like flies. They were taken to Beatrice Road Infectious Disease Hospital and were being treated there. Some of them survived, but mostly kids and elderly died. When they died, you were not allowed to take the corpse at home like our tradition says we should. The corpse would be wrapped in a plastic bag and buried, and we were not allowed to touch it." Tsitsi continued. She emphasized the deplorable state of the city's water supply. Most of the time, she explained to me, the taps ran completely dry, but on the odd occasion when liquid did come out, it often emitted a pungent smell and bore visible traces of human waste. In her own words, in 2008, if you opened the water, it was so dirty you could even see the shit coming out of the taps. In thinking back to this period, Tsitsi not only bemoaned the poor water supply, but also the lack of food, money, and jobs. For Tsitsi and many others working in the informal sector, the economic disaster had an inescapably despondent character. It meant more queues, more vending, more begging, more stealing, more sex work, and more desperate faces, all interspersed by occasional fits of prayer, reminiscence, rage, and alcohol-fueled bravado. To quote Samson, a resident of Glenora and a primary school teacher in Glenview, what was worse was that the political field was so polarized. Now, the cholera outbreak had happened only a matter of months after Zimbabwe's most violent elections in the post-independent period. Samson continues, there was so much political violence prior to the outbreak of the disease. We had people running away from their rural homes because of the violence. By the time they came here to the city, they thought there was safety, but then they found an outbreak. Everything made everything else very difficult. The politics of the day was what mattered most. It was that which created this monster. If the politics was stable and people were going to work, I think the outbreak would have been managed much earlier and the deaths could have been prevented. As cholera ravaged Harare's high-density areas, many Zimbabweans watched with concern, then disbelief, and eventually horror as scores of people succumbed to the infection. In the first 3 months of the outbreak, before it was declared a national disaster, the Ministry of Health desperately promoted individual health behaviors to curtail the spread of cholera. They extolled the virtues of good hygiene, such as hand washing, drinking clean water, eating hot food, and so forth. And this was their strategy for both explaining and addressing the outbreak. In the townships, of course, issues such as the death of citizens from a preventable and treatable disease, without any official accountability, the government evading responsibility for causing the outbreak, poor public service provision, and blaming and denigrating the poor for their illness recurred repeatedly across almost all my discussions. When residents were instructed to change their individual behaviors to curtail the transmission of cholera, they were quick to identify the immediate drivers of the outbreak as structural, specifically the collapsing water and sanitation infrastructure and the ever-expanding squalor in their neighborhoods, as depicted in this image. But my informant's analysis actually ran deeper. They recognized that the delivery of clean and potable water, the collection of refuse, and the provision of medical care entails this extraordinary chain of human and non-human actors that link them as township residents or indeed as citizens to wider political structures. This chain includes the state and local government, Morton Jaffrey Waterworks, engineers, electricity supplies, water treatment chemicals, doctors, nurses, food supplies, medicines, and so forth. And residents were thus aware of their vulnerability at every step where links in this chain might be missing or broken, particularly in the context of a wider political economic collapse. Thus, my residents stressed that the functioning of this chain or network of chains comes down, as it so often does, to politics. So through the commentaries that they offered me, we see political subjectivities emerging from the cholera outbreak, especially as my informants vented their outrage at what they saw as a cruel and callous state willing to cause harm to them as unwanted members of the body politic. How else then to explain their sense of being neglected at a time of crisis? How else to explain the lack of investment in infrastructure and the poor service provision? This was most evident in the political etiologies that my informants formulated. They extended the pain of the pathological organ, an intestine stricken with cholera, to implicate a pathological government guilty of corrupting state institutions, polluting public water supply, mismanaging household and environmental waste, and providing inadequate or unsafe food. In the words of several of my informants, the government is the one who caused cholera. The implacable ruthlessness of cholera left behind a spectacle of death. The bodies of the disease's victims, who were the friends, lovers, family, and neighbors of my informants, laid bare the political and class fault lines that marked the difference between those seen to have full citizenship rights and those who felt they'd been excommunicated from the sphere of political concern. Cholera revealed that the state no longer provided welfare protection for the urban poor. Chido, a teenage girl in Buririro, said to me, "There was no time to buy coffins, no need to buy food for the funeral, and no one cried because everyone was very close to death. People died every minute, and yet the government said there was no cholera in Zimbabwe. Why? Because they wanted people to suffer." Now, the phrase I heard most commonly when I asked people why they thought that cholera why there had been such a delayed and ineffective response to the outbreak was "Havasisina basa nevanu," Chishona for "they no longer care about the people." Many of my informants insisted that the state had been transformed from an entity committed to delivering healthcare and development to its people into a punishing institution, intent on treating township residents not as citizens, but a dispensable population to be managed, politically exploited, beaten into submission, or made to disappear according to the whims of the ruling party. James Munyaradzi, a resident of Chitunguiza and a local NGO worker, explained to me the extent to which the government had lost credibility in many of the townships. He captured popular sentiment most accurately in the words, "Not because of cholera alone, but especially in areas where there was cholera, people do not trust the state. They don't believe in it." And then he added that around election time, government officials come and say they want to start a project in the townships, and the general sentiment is just disinterest. People don't care anymore. So what then are we to make of all of these stories? What I'm positing is that the cholera outbreak tells a much wider story than acute watery diarrhea might have you believe. After all local epidemics are part of a global story. The cholera outbreak within my larger corpus of work is a unique prism for viewing the interconnections and convergence of multiple facets of Zimbabwe's urban crisis. The stories, the few that I've recounted here, explicitly link the cholera outbreak to an array of social and material processes, from the failure of Zimbabwe's public health infrastructure and urban governance, to the electoral violence of 2008, to the economic strategies people pursued for survival, to the arbitrary, spectacular, and violent actions of the ruling party taken to keep itself in power. The cholera outbreak allows us to see how these facets converged, but also mediated and differentiated human life according to social and economic markers such as class, location, political party affiliation, gender, and age. This convergence, mediation, and differentiation is captured in that sentiment of Samuel, the primary school teacher, that everything made everything else very difficult. For township residents, the outbreak became, therefore, an important site of evaluating the legitimacy of the ruling government, of venting anger at ZANU-PF's manifest failings, and of finding ways of making do when the state was no longer able or was unwilling to deliver. Cholera thus instantiated a politics of disposability, the sense that people had been rendered as waste, a politics of expectation, the frustrated hopes that the state they had once believed in was no longer willing to deliver, as well as a politics of adaptation, the fact that they felt that they were on their own to make do as political subjectivities. Through the cholera stories collated and documented here, my interlocutors speak from an apparent position of victimhood. Yet at the same time, I want to suggest they also articulate their expectations of political authority. Thus, what we see here is not pure passivity. We see and we hear people laying claims to substantive citizenship, indexed by access to public service and infrastructural development of the townships. And we also see the discrediting of failing institutions within the bureaucracy, within government, and within politics. Lastly, I've tried to demonstrate in this presentation the layers of meaning with which an epidemic is endowed even years after its occurrence. Evidently, cholera has been committed to historical memory as an integral component of the nadir of Zimbabwe's political crisis and socioeconomic collapse. For many township residents, much like the doctors and civil servants that I discuss elsewhere in my work, cholera signaled the lost telos of Zimbabwe's liberation ideals. Chido and Gamu, the two teenage girls I spoke to in Buririro, said to me, I think Zimbabwe needs to copy the revolution in Libya because we were born in poverty, we live in poverty, and we will die in poverty. And this resignation towards a hopeless future, now we see being radically upended through the cries of jubilation, the tears of joy, the weeping at the removal of an ousted president, and the fragile yet expectant hope that a new Zimbabwe has been born. I hope that this popular sentiment may carry some weight and some substance behind it. Otherwise, I may be resigned to the morose sentiment articulated to me by Favor, an unemployed sanitation engineer in Buririro, who said at the end of our interview, I think if cholera is to come back, it's going to wipe us all out. Thank you very much.
Very fascinating, right? We'll open for a few minutes of questions. So if anyone wants to go first, yeah, there you go. Ooh, wow, okay.
Hi, my name is Gilbert. I'm sure this is obviously a gross oversimplification of your erudite work. So if my question is sort of off mark, forgive me. But in terms of voices, because you're relying on stories as the tool for showcasing the epidemic. So in terms of the voices of non-state actors, for example, like the private sector or NGOs and so forth, did they sort of play a role or feature in the narrative that you present to us? And secondly, in terms of the sort of nomenclature that you use, the names that, for example, other people would say slums, but obviously you use a very different name for it in the presentation. Was that a deliberate choice that you were using as a stylistic device in telling this story? Or is it just something that you went with? Yeah, thanks.
So thanks for that. I'll start with your second question. Yeah, it's a deliberate choice to call them townships. That's partly because that's how they're popularly known, but it's also an important part of my work is about the history of and politics of urban inequality. And the naming of these locations has shifted over time, reflecting different kinds of projects, different ways of imagining and creating urban order. I found that townships, not only because it's used in popular parlance, but is perhaps the most neutral term. Slums has a pejorative connotation to it on one hand. On the other hand, I think that to call them slums kind of diminishes a bit quite what they are. I think slums is too loaded with certain kinds of images. And I want to highlight how exceptional and bizarre this particular episode of history was. So by calling them townships, I'm able to show that this period represents a radical departure from what had been before. In terms of voices, I do look quite a panoramic way across the thesis at voices in government, in civil service, in the multilateral sector, in the development sector, and so on and so forth. One of the things that emerged most strongly from non-state actors involved in the intervention was essentially that they found that the politics of this cholera outbreak were too great to surmount, so they focused primarily on saving lives, if you like, a lowest common denominator logic for mobilizing action. Now this conflicted, which I didn't really discuss now, but it conflicted and evoked attention with what my township informants were saying. Because on the one hand, they were like, yeah, of course we've given up on the state and we do need clean water and we need medicines and so forth. So in this sense, NGOs were welcome. But on the other hand, it frustrated their expectations because they kept saying to NGO workers that this is essentially a Band-Aid on a broken leg. And they wanted something much more fundamental.
Okay. My name is Alexander. I'm in the School of Geography. In a way, your last point has answered part of my first question, which is like, what was the international community's involvement with respect to this? I recall in those days, I remember I was watching the TV and the president, Robert Mugabe, obviously, I think the UK Prime Minister then, Tony Blair, because it was, a global issue, and there were those sentiments that some action needs to be taken in Zimbabwe to save the people who were passing. And Mugabe was on record to have said that, should we say because cholera has invaded Zimbabwe, we should invade, Zimbabwe and get up the government? What of the mad cow disease that happened in the UK? I don't know if you got that information, but the point is, beyond that, and beyond the interventions of, NGOs, as you've mentioned, which my understanding is that it was really too little, probably too late, if they did intervene at all. Who, like World Health Organization and some of these international organizations, what were their involvement? And then, okay. And then in terms of, as a geographer, I'm interested in the speciality of it, where it started and how it started. Of course, we know that cholera or disease has no boundaries, but, is it a case like probably historically these are areas that have been underserved in terms of, provision of infrastructure, and we have demographics as to, the number of, or let's say, the middle income and then the relatively well-to-dos within, Harare, because you mentioned that it even went to... Okay, so let me just end there.
Yeah, no, so I think you've kind of asked and answered just your own question, which is that, and it was sort of what I was saying at the beginning, was that that disasters are essentially social phenomena. So a lot of the demographic and epidemiological data very clearly shows that cholera mapped onto patterns of socioeconomic inequality, and also traveled with people who were involved in informal sector trade and so forth. And the patterns of mobility itself were tied to socioeconomic inequality. And then briefly on Mugabe's comment, I think that this is, in terms of the politics, a question of political legitimacy and political sovereignty, right? So legitimacy in the sense that if you are claiming to be a state capable of managing its own affairs, and you succumb to the most basic of bacterial infections, it shows that something has gone wrong. So one of the strategies of managing that was to either downplay the extent of the outbreak or to deflect attention away from it. And then the sovereignty angle was a way of trying to push external actors from probing further into all of the things that were going wrong in Zimbabwe. Hence these claims that, outside actors can't intervene. At the same time, there were important outside actors saying that Zimbabwe should be intervened on the grounds of responsibility to protect, that the state had so catastrophically failed to manage its internal affairs that the international community had a mandate to come in and intervene. So there was this dual tension over sovereignty and the right to intervene, which it was an extension of a question of legitimacy.
Great, thank you. My name is Kaya, and I'm a student at the Center for Tropical Medicine Global Health. And I'm just interested to know how you dealt with your own positionality in this, because I'm assuming you have your own medical background and also your interest in politics, and you obviously came in with some views. How did you deal with that while maintaining the integrity of the voices that came through? And specifically about the voices, it seems everyone, potentially besides the government officials that you interviewed, seem to put blame on the government. Were there any other people who actually didn't share that kind of view?
So I'll start again with the latter first. I think many of the people within the government blame the government. But that's also to say that the government is not a singular or unitary entity, right? And so part of the thing that I'm not able to sort of fully lay out is I'm using terms like the state or like the government as if these are kind of unitary or ontologically coherent objects, which they aren't. Governments are made up of very many different kinds of institutions, and people interact and experience them in many different kinds of ways. And many of my informants were astute, and keenly aware of that. So people would make a discrimination between what the Ministry of Health is doing versus what the Ministry of Information is saying, and those kinds of differentiations. And at the same time, some people said the problem here is, say, a certain cadre of ministers within the government that they saw as problematic elements that were responsible for the corruption, and not everyone in it. And so a little bit about what I was saying as well about how what's so vexing about writing about this is that the voices are in fact so multifarious, that there are all of these subtle variations on different kinds of things, and trying to bring them all together is extremely difficult. In terms of my own positionality, I think especially where it came to township interviews, because a vast number of my interviews were with experts and with elites and with people who are coming from positions of social power who can articulate their version of events quite clearly, even as they variously blamed themselves or blamed other institutions and so forth. Within the township, I really tried to understand my work as a collaborative alliance. Many of the analytical moves that I presented here were born of the discussions I had. So it was by asking very, very general questions of saying, what was life like for you in 2008? I caveated by explaining that I am an upper middle class Zimbabwean who has lived in the UK since I was about 16 and who wasn't there, who didn't experience the crisis in its rawest, most visceral form. And I want to know what this was like for you if you're willing to talk about it. And so I think that I was stunned and taken aback at the extent to which people would tell their stories and make these connections themselves. It's only in writing that I add a rhetorical flourish to it, but the analysis is borne out in this kind of collaboration.
Thank you so much, Simukai. Thank you so much. I'm going to give the floor to Kevin Marsh, who's our director, to give a few closing remarks.
Thanks very much. Well, Anne's already given the warning that we can't speak any longer because there's wine outside. So I just want to repeat the thanks. The one thing I will say is that thank you all for coming to the whole point of the Insakas is a networking event. We ask our speakers to do just a very simple thing. We say to them, we don't care what you speak about. We deliberately pick people from quite different perspectives, as you've seen today, and I hope that works. And we say, we don't care what you talk about, so long as it is within the half hour and it is interesting. And I think you'll agree that both the talks today fitted that perfectly. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, and the contrast between, but they were united by being excellent talks. So we're going to finish there. You're all welcome to join us for wine and for networking. And it's come up now, so I can show you the dates to the next Insakas. Please, if you've enjoyed this one, come to our next ones. Please tell all your colleagues who've got any interest at all in collaborations between Oxford and any area of research in Africa. Please encourage them to come. We are going for wine next door. I was told at the last minute something I didn't know about the Martin School, which is they only serve white wine because apparently the carpets are so expensive to repair that we're not allowed to have red wine. So that's why you'll only find white wine and soft drinks next door. But please do come and join us and continue to talk to the speakers.